Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Reason Through podcast, a show where we have philosophical discussions and help you reason through your views. In this episode, I speak with Dr. Carolyn Dicey Jennings on her book, The Intending Mind. We speak on the role of attention in the brain, the self, consciousness, and neuroscience. If you find value in what I'm doing, please consider subscribing. And if you are on Apple, rating and reviewing the podcast as it shows your support, and I would greatly appreciate it. And without further ado, I bring you Dr. Jennings. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode. Today with me, I have Dr. Carolyn Dicey Jennings. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Happy to be here.
Yeah. So before we get started on our topic today, if you wouldn't mind telling our listeners who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me on the podcast. It's a really cool initiative, and I'm glad that you're doing it. I love the idea of trying to bring philosophy to the public a little bit more, and also your style sounds really amenable to my own goals. So thank you for that. I work at University of California, Merced in the Cognitive and Information Sciences department. But my background training is in both philosophy and in psychology with a neuroscience angle. So I would introduce myself as someone who I consider myself a philosopher, but a philosopher who is informed by science and who engages a lot with science. I'm an associate professor of philosophy and cognitive science at UC Merced. And yeah, I think that's a pretty good intro. Let's start there.
Yeah, definitely. And so before kind of moving on to our topic and one of your recent books, how did you kind of get into the field you are in now? Did it start off with psychology first, then philosophy, or was it just or was it the other way around? Or yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The narrative that I tell myself is that I was really fascinated by physics, actually. And I came across a claim by Stephen Hawking that anyone interested in physics should also be engaged with philosophy. When I was in high school, I read that. And I decided to go to college for physics and philosophy. And then kind of bit by bit, I became disenchanted with physics and then later philosophy of physics. So I felt when I took physics courses that they weren't enough interested in the phenomena behind what they were studying. It seemed like they were more interested in just manipulating the phenomena and not understanding them. And then when I started grad school in philosophy of physics, I started becoming frustrated by the community of philosophy of physics. I felt that there wasn't as much discussion between physicists and philosophers as I would have liked. And I went to my first conference it was the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, the first conference that combined psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy. And I just found a huge amount of engagement between the philosophers and the psychologists and neuroscientists. And that was something I'd been really missing in philosophy of physics. So I would say I started in this area more as a kind of outsider. I thought I was totally a philosopher of physics. But then the more time I spent in this area, the more fun I was having. And so I ended up just dropping philosophy of physics and completely moving over to, I would say, like philosophy and the mind sciences.
And right now, that's kind of your primary study, right? It's more philosophy of mind rather than psychology. Because I know there's another book I think you recently either co-authored with or edited with, which is, I think, an introductory to neuroscience.
Yeah, I edited a book with Ben Young, Mind, Cognition, and Neuroscience, a philosophical introduction. That's more of it's a textbook for people in introduction to cognitive science or introduction to cognitive neuroscience, or you could possibly use it in a philosophy of mind class too. I've done that before, but it's chapters and different topics that combine philosophy and cognitive neuroscience and cognitive science. So there's chapters on perception and action and emotion, for example, and it's intended for undergraduates and early graduate students to learn more about the overlap between those areas. But yeah, to answer your question, yes, I consider myself to be primarily a philosopher.
Yeah. Very cool. And it's kind of one of the things where I think the more I started, and we were chatting about this earlier, but what I'm starting to learn that a lot of the fields have like the philosophical underpinnings.
Mm,
And but then, like for example, like within my grad school, there's definitely an underpinnings within its philosophy, some that I like definitely disagree with, but it's not necessarily talked about. It's just kind of it's after the fact. So it kind of reminds me a little bit like we were talking about with like with physics, where it's more here's kind of what we understand a little bit, but then
uh,
let's see where the consequences of those things that's already kind of assumed to be true. Um, and
yeah.
so, yeah, like I've noticed that a lot of things have like a philosophical basis for it that either people put forward and they don't realize they're putting forward. Like I'm like, oh, that's kind of controversial, or yeah, okay, I can see something like that. But yeah.
I
Mhm.
agree. Yeah, I think that a lot of the time, well, there are many different ways of understanding what philosophy is.
Mhm.
But one way is sort of the way you were just describing it. It's like the deeper or more abstract version of all these different topics. So that makes philosophy something that a lot of people do. Maybe everyone does. Everyone sometimes thinks more deeply or abstractly about a topic. But most of the time, we don't want to do that. Most of the time, we want to have certain assumptions and just kind of move along in that topic, try to get things done. But every once in a while, we come across some kind of problem, and then we kind of have to step back and see, well, which one of those assumptions is wrong. And then I think that's where you're doing something more like philosophy a lot of the time.
Yeah, definitely. So kind of want to segue into the
Yeah.
main bulk of the kind of topic that we'll be discussing, which is your recent book or one of your recent books, The Attending Mind. And so, if you don't mind, kind of giving a little introductory about what it was kind of it's about a little bit, and then we can kind of go into some of like the history behind um, the attention that you are speaking of.
Yeah, good. Okay, so this is my first book, The Attending Mind, and I was very excited to get a chance to work on it because it gave me a chance to explore these topics really deeply. I would say there's a lot going on in the book, but a theme of the book is that attention is a core function of the mind, and that attention can reveal a lot of interesting things about the mind, and that it can even be used to solve some of the main problems in philosophy of mind. So the ones that I'm most focused on in the book include the question of whether there is a self. So the book argues for the existence of a self, a naturalized self. That is something that, although most people would be surprised by, probably that's somewhat controversial in philosophy of mind and cognitive science. And so that's probably the most controversial claim that I make in the book is that attention provides room to argue for the existence of a natural self, a self that's existence with the best science. Um, I have another claim that was controversial when I first made it, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, but isn't as controversial now, which is that attention is necessary for perception, for conscious perception. So attention plays this crucial role in allowing us to perceive the world. And then also controversial it would be that attention is not necessary for conscious awareness in general, for consciousness in general, and it's not necessary for action. So one way of looking at the book is that it's both showing you what role attention plays in the mind, and then also what roles it doesn't need to play, what things the mind can do without attention.
And I think what I definitely like from like the onset of the book is that you're not just picking like one area, I guess, like of inquiry, right? So, and like your approach is like, I think you stated kind of right in the forefront, which is I'm taking uh, this data set of like phenomenology, like that kind of data point, and then a data set of the empirical sciences, what they're telling us, and then taking from philosophy, so like philosophy of mind
Yeah.
type things, and kind of what's been talked about for years and years. And so, I guess um, moving from that, attention has typically, I guess, I don't know if this is a common theme within the history of attention, but you, I think, labeled that there's two main or probably dominant theories of attention. One was attention for selection, and then one was attention as opposed to there's within our sensory perception, there's so much data out there that we have to limit our attention. So those are, oh no, sorry. one was for selection for action, and the other one was a theory of because there's so much data out there, we have to limit our attention and kind of focus on the things that are important to us or that we're interested in. I think that's kind of like a little brief history, but you can go if you want to go more into depth, kind of about like that, how philosophers and people have been talking about it for some time.
Yeah, good. So the one of the chapters of the book, which I think is I hope that it's helpful to people who are starting out on the philosophy of attention, is the philosophical landscape on attention. And one reason that I wrote that chapter is that I wasn't finding a lot on the history of work in philosophy on attention. And a narrative in contemporary philosophy literature is that there isn't really that much work. So people, it almost looks like there isn't any work, and then all of a sudden you see a bunch of books popping up in like the 2010s, books and articles popping up. So I wanted to kind of go back in time and see, well, what's going on here? What's happening in philosophy on this topic? One of the reasons I was so motivated is it's a huge topic in psychology. It's arguably the biggest topic in psychology. I've seen that claim made in print. So why isn't it in philosophy? I mean, psychology only broke away from philosophy 100 years ago. Why is it completely absent from philosophy and it dominates psychology? So what I found was that it just isn't true that it's absent in the in the history of philosophy. Um, that you do see it coming up again and again. Really, it's really dominant in what you might call Indian philosophy. So philosophy from the Indian subcontinent. There is a lot of discussion about what attention is, what role it's playing in the mind, what does it tell you about the mind. There's a lot of that in Indian philosophy. In so-called Western philosophy, it's discussed a little bit differently, and I used someone's dissertation work on the concept of philosophy to talk a little bit about that, because in this dissertation work, the author argued that the scientific conception of attention only shows up at around the time of Descartes, but you actually see the concept that he sees as coming up in Descartes in Indian philosophy thousands of years before that. So it is interesting how the concept has evolved. The way that attention is most discussed in articles now is, I think, as a selection of information idea. It's the idea that you see in lots of articles printed again and again is something like this. There's too much information around us. We have to reduce that information, and so we have attention. But that story isn't a complete story, as I start to argue at the beginning of that historical chapter, that you need to know what the reduction is for to have the complete story. And so filling in that part of the explanation is where accounts of attention diverge. And one of the, I think, most compelling accounts of attention, not my own, but one of the most compelling accounts is Wayne Wu's. And he says that attention is what is basically selects information for action. So it's attention rather than some other form of selection when the selection is used for action. One of the reasons you need to fill in that latter part of the account is that there are many different selective mechanisms in nature and in the brain. And you don't want to call all of those things attention. We know that we use the concept of attention in a more focused way. So we know that it doesn't mean like natural selection is not attention. And selection of different wavelengths in the eyes is not attention. So trying to figure out when you get from a selection of information to attention is really important. For Wayne Wu, that happens at, he says, when we have selection for action. And for me, I solve that problem a different way. I say it's when it's selection by a subject. So it's not, I think that selection can be for lots of different things, but that it's when a subject is doing the selecting that it is attention. You can see how those are really different approaches. But I admire Wayne Wu's work a lot, and I think he's also very motivated by the empirical evidence. So that's one reason I focus on his work there.
Yeah, perfect. And so kind of this kind of the way you are describing attention and the way that you are kind of how it's kind of more from the subject is doing the attending or kind of is doing the focusing. This is kind of what you're saying, like more of your controversial claim, which is more about like there's the self that we have that is doing the attending or that is, yeah, in some sense doing the attending. And I guess in contemporary philosophy of I don't know if I wouldn't say maybe philosophy of mind, but I guess what you had mentioned earlier about in the cognitive sciences, where it's kind of there's more of an illusionist type view where there isn't really a self
Hmm.
that's doing the attending, right? And there's certain exercises, I guess, to trying to demonstrate that there isn't a self that's doing the attending. It's just kind of the content of experience. Um, and so, but you take a different approach. You want to say, no, that's actually not the case. It's you. There's a self there. So if you kind of want to explore a little bit of that, and kind of actually, and then argue there from like some type of mental causation type of view, um, which I'm not sure if you still do you hold to that, but yeah, if you don't mind explaining
Here's
that.
a Yeah. Okay. Well, to start with, I think a really good entry point is to combat the opposing view. So the opposing view, as you said, is this kind of illusionist view. The self is an illusion. You see that come up in a lot of different places. Some of the places I've seen it come up the most are like meditation literature, and then literature on like psychedelic states or drug induced or altered states. So in the you could see meditation as an altered state, but I'll just treat it as separately right now. So you see sometimes people saying with meditation that when they at the beginning stages of meditation, let's say you're doing something like focusing on your breath.
Hmm.
And then over time, maybe you broaden your attention so that you just have open awareness meditation. You're just aware of your surroundings in general. And as you go on even further and you become a really expert meditator, sometimes people say that they lose the sense of self, that experience is just there and that the self kind of melts away. And that reveals that the self is an illusion and that experience is really at the core of reality rather than the self world dichotomy. But that's a really commonly that's a common set of claims about meditation. Maybe not exactly how I phrased it, but the basic ideas. Okay, and then with the altered state stuff, people will say, I took a psychedelic drug, or I did some long distance running, or I did I don't know, some dancing or something. I did those things and I suddenly lost my sense of self and it felt so real. And I now know that that commitment to self is something I don't need. And I realize that I'm just one thing in the universe and that it goes far beyond me and I shouldn't be so worried about myself and I should be more connected with other things. So there's lots of spiritual advancements and stuff like that people have through these experiences. I'm not trying to diminish them in any way, but focusing just on this one part of they lose a sense of self and they conclude from that there is no sense of self. Yeah. Okay. So I hear this a lot and I see this a lot. And one of the main differences between my approach and what I take to be assumptions behind that approach are that I think people who are committed to those claims about meditation and altered states are committed to experiential evidence as the major type of evidence, the most important form of evidence. And I am not. So for me, I take experiential evidence to be just one type of evidence that I'm going to use in my argumentation and my reasoning. And that's partly because that's my method in general with this kind of combined philosophy and sciences of mind approach, that I think experience is defeasible. It's not always right, doesn't always point to the truth. If you want to get at reality, I think you need to pay attention to experience, you need to pay attention to behavior, you need to pay attention to the results of neuroscience. That's something that Owen Flanagan calls the natural method. That you try to combine those three almost as a kind of triangulation, like that the truth isn't in experience or behavior or in the brain. The truth is something that you access through those other things. So if you see it that way, if you set aside the idea that experience is the ultimate form of evidence, and you're open to the idea that behavior in the brain combined with experience could tell you something different, then I think you can see why you might not want to trust the absence of a sense of self as telling you that there's no self. It could be that you lose your sense of self, but that's not actually telling you anything about reality. Just like you could suddenly become dizzy and lose your sense of balance in the world, lose your sense of where the stable world is, and you wouldn't think the world itself is unstable, even though your experience of the world is unstable. Um, so I think where that kind of argument goes wrong is in thinking that when they have these altered states that they are getting closer to reality rather than further away. But I didn't really tell you what
Mm.
my argument was, but I feel like that can help you at least as a starting point to see
It
where I'm coming
it
from.
definitely is because I've heard conversations like that too, where they'll use the reflection or that kind of introspection in meditation to argue that the self is not there.
Mhm.
Um, but it's kind of like more of like I feel like after just because it's very salient in my mind, just from reading your book, I feel like that could be an argument for kind of what you talk about, like just like a hyper focused state where, you're still like there's still the subjects there, but they're just focusing particularly on one particular thing, action, whatever that they're doing, that the barriers between me and this computer or this desk that's in front of me or mic, whatever, is I quote unquote like lost it. Um, but part of your argument, at least from what I remember, within this chapter, was that looking at neuroscience, there's this bottom up and top down process that are going on, um, kind of from the sense data that we have that goes into our brain to specific cortexes, and then that gets distributed throughout, and then we kind of have behavioral output. And kind of looking at that process, um, and what neuroscience is saying is more of like, well, there is the brain. There's certain mechanisms or functions of the brain, such as like the prefrontal. I'm not even going to try to get into it, but like the prefrontal cortex, just because I'm
Yeah.
not very well keen on it. But I'm assuming something like that actually is doing the attending, or not the attending, but part of that function is to, focus on things or to mediate some of that content, um, which is part of the function of a brain or the brain that we're seeing. And you're using that, in some sense, right, as another data point to argue for that there is a self that's there. It's yeah.
Yeah, so you're right. I have a positive argument for the self. It's not just kind of refuting these other arguments. I would actually say primarily that chapter is a positive argument. And the positive argument, here's a really simple way of seeing it. The positive argument is saying, look, there are these different types of evidence that all point to the self. And it's just much more likely that the self exists than that it doesn't, given all that evidence. And the types of evidence include things like the phenomenological evidence would be the sense of effort that you have when you use voluntary or top down attention. And so, what that is like is if there's something distracting around you right now in the podcast, like somebody walks in behind you or something like that, that would be your bottom up attention. And if even in the face of that distraction, you nonetheless are able to maintain attention on the podcast, that will feel to you a lot of the time as effortful, as something that's difficult. That sense of effort, I think, is the first sign that the self is doing something. It's not, you're not just going with the flow. Sometimes you're doing something. There is evidence of a self's activity. And I think that effort is the first sign of that. And then in behavior, you can tell when you're talking, like when you're engaged with someone, if they're paying attention to you or if they're not. I think that's something that we can do intuitively, but psychologists have used these careful behavioral experiments to be able to tell what happens to your behavior when you have top down attention engaged and when you have bottom up attention engaged. So we found these fine grained differences between that. And then neuroscientists have used those behavioral studies to see what happens in the brain when you have top down versus bottom up attention engaged. So when it's you directing your attention and when your attention is being grabbed by something else. And they found differences there too. So all that evidence, I think, points more towards a self than a not self. I go beyond that basic story. That story I have been telling almost since 2012. I have a paper called The Subject of Attention where I make the case using that different evidence. But in the book, I go further because I want to say that there's something really interesting that happens in the brain at the whole brain level. And this, I think, is a really exciting turn in neuroscience that people have started rejecting certain forms of reductionism and started arguing that there's something you might call emergence. That is, there are things happening at the whole brain level that can't be reduced to a finer grain. That is, you can't just look at like neuron to neuron and understand the self or consciousness or anything like that, anything interesting happening in the mind. You have to look at network properties, that is, things that are happening across the brain. And that I think is a more interesting part of the chapter, is where I start talking about how top down attention isn't just one neuron going to another neuron. Top down attention, that when, for example, you maintain attention on the podcast despite distractions, that what's happening there is that you have cross brain activity that's weighing all of your interests and your motivations. And it's basically giving the one of those activities more weight depending on all of your interests and your motivations. And I think that's really interesting that it could do that, that's a special property of the brain. That's something I want to argue for and other people want to argue for, that's something that the brain can do. And that's what I think of as the self, is that whole brain activity. So your whole set of interests and motivations is the self. And when your attention, your focus is directed by your whole set of motivations, then you could say that you're directing your focus, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And that's one thing I was going to ask, if you can define what you had meant by the
Mhm.
self, because I think in some sense philosophers, and I get in some in the cognitive sciences, when they're, I guess, looking at the self, and why I think one would say that there's an illusion, is that they're not saying that there's like a ghost in the machine in some sense, or like there's this little tiny person that's kind of like doing the operating and like,
Mhm.
directing things.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's not the self that you're even at. I would say you're not advocating for that. I don't think you are arguing for that. It's more of just like kind of what you just said, the whole kind of brain activity that's guiding the interest, and kind of organizing which ones they're going to attend to, which the
Yeah.
subject would attend to. And it kind of, I guess that goes into like why there would be something as like the mental causation, is what you're saying, because what else would mental causation, I guess, like look like?
Mhm.
Um, and when you develop it in the way that you have, at least in that chapter, um, it's one of those things where I'm like, okay, yeah, that's a completely naturalistic type of account for some type of mental causation, because the literature goes back to, I think, Descartes with the soul and all that, and that stuff like that,
Mhm.
where how can something abstract or immaterial cause the material to do something like
Right.
that? Kind of like that, this closure principle, something like that. But yeah, when you uh, were talking about the way in which how that could be some type, this could be some type of mental causation. It's like, okay, yeah, that seems, yeah, like legitimate and very in a very naturalistic type of way explaining it. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. I should have you do my PR.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it makes sense to me, but at the same time, it's like it's one of those things where I'm like, there's so much, again, there's so much that I'm sure
Mm.
you have had, that's one of my questions I'm gonna ask. Have you had pushback on some of this, at least maybe in this chapter or just in general with the book?
So the kinds of pushback that I get very regularly ever since I was a graduate student are things like, that's such a bold claim. That's such a dramatic claim. And so that kind of pushback is more like, I don't want to believe this, rather than engaging deeply with the reasoning. And I think that is one of the things I face a lot in my work, is I go so strongly against the grain of philosophy and cognitive science right now, that I think it's uncomfortable for a lot of philosophers because they don't know what to do with it. Um, so I would say that that's probably my primary pushback, or just kind of disbelief and maybe even anger that I'm trying to make the claims that I do.
Yeah.
But I have heard, of course, like there are some really helpful, more careful uh, ways of criticizing my view
Hmm.
that aren't always, they're not always framed as about my view, but I can see them as opposing positions to my view.
Yeah.
So not targeting me specifically, but so an example would be Janardin Ganeri. He has a book called Attention Not Self, about arguing for a reconsideration of how we think about the self in the sciences, getting away from the top down, bottom up distinction. And as you can tell from the title of the book, kind of arguing that we should replace the role of a self with the role of attention in our theorizing. And he's really motivated by the work of Buddha Goja and other Buddhist philosophers from Indian philosophy. So his view is really different from my own in certain ways. It sounds Like it's the opposite of my view. And yet when he and I have had discussions together, it's sometimes hard to find the daylight between our views because we agree on many things and then we
Hmm.
disagree on some core things like, well, is this mean it's a self or not? Um, Talking to Janardin has been really helpful. And so people who are interested in the attending mind might also be interested in attention, not self. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I would say that's a good place to start.
Yeah, and I can see the motivation behind at least some type of views like physicalism or materialism in the sense where I think what's happening, and I can understand the concern where, like, if you have this like weak emergence, right? Essentially, though, like the what's going on in the brain is kind of is reducible to the physical processes that's going on, rather than what you're advocating for is kind of more of a is like what you said earlier was more of like a non-reductive approach to, but it's still material, which it's like I don't feel like there's nothing being added on, like there's no other commitments that would have there, and there's there's maybe other conflicting things like what does that mean for like our freedom, like a free will type of thing, and type of moral responsibility. I can see that conflicting with it, but I don't know, when I think about it, if I look at it in the sense like if I adopted this view or adopt the view, what would this add or what would this take away? And if anything, it just kind of adds a little bit more clarity, just because I mean, like I've said, I don't really have enough training on brain science or cognitive science, and just learning about it, about how it's structured and the function of it. It's like, okay, yeah, that's something that's like I said, like that's what it would look like. Um,
Yeah, I think I like the way you put it. I think it is more that's what it has been for me is helping me to understand the different evidence that I've seen.
mhm.
So it's kind of like a resituating of I don't know the data rather than like saying, oh, there's this whole new thing. It's like they're looking at things from a different angle
Yeah,
rather than starting completely afresh with like a whole new worldview.
yeah. Like there's no substance you're adding in a dualistic way,
Right.
where you're not adding in this new substance that is completely
No.
mysterious to everyone, and that
But
explains things.
I think there is, I guess, and this isn't unique to me, but there is this new way of thinking about science, kind of emergence view, and many people are trying to understand how to talk about emergence and what emergence really is, and not that it's just one thing, but what are the different forms of emergence and how can we clarify what it is in these different situations. But minimally, one of the things I think is really interesting that people are working on is that biological creatures seem like they have a capacity for self determination. Living creatures have a capacity for self determination. And that self determination, I think, is associated with this type of emergence. And I think of what's happening with the mind as being some version of that self determination. So it's almost like you have boundaries being drawn by these living things to separate themselves from the world. And then with the mind, you have another level of a boundary being drawn. So it's almost like the living thing is determining for itself what is self and what is world. So it's creating itself. And I think that's a really interesting natural possibility. It doesn't mean that there's a new thing that pops out of nowhere, the self, but it is new in one sense, even if it's created by the living thing as just kind of a line, at least at the beginning, then it's still interesting that it's possible to do that, that living things can do that. And so I think understanding what that is and how it works, I think would be really great for science. And I do think it has a capacity to account for these puzzles you talked about, like the possibility of free will. Free will doesn't mean you get a will from nowhere, like a kind of mysterious, bootstrappy free will. But it might nonetheless be that at the level of that organism, you're like, yes, they're doing something.
Mhm.
Even if you zoomed out to take all the universe into the equation, maybe you could account for what they were doing with all of that data. If you zoom in on the organism, it seems like they are doing something for themselves.
Mhm.
I don't know if that makes
Yeah,
sense,
yeah,
but
yeah. I do have a question. So, in your view,
hmm.
would you say that if the absent language, would there still be, in some sense, like a self? Because in some disciplines, that at least within psychology disciplines, where the role of language kind of guides the self and kind of relates to that in some sense. So I'm wondering if you're in view, if you took away language, so go back, in a time where there's no language, um, would there still be a self, or would there still be, yeah, like what do you think are, yeah.
I definitely think that language is not required for the self. So that's also, I think, a really interesting development in philosophy and cognitive sciences. That for a while, language was seen as the core of consciousness, and everything interesting about the mind. And I think people are now realizing that that's not necessarily the case, and it's really opened up the possibility that there are different forms of cognition in the animal world that are interesting too. So I think as long as we were committed to language being the core of everything interesting about the mind, we were missing the interesting forms of animal cognition because we were like, oh, they don't have language, so they have nothing. So what I think is really key to the self is attention, and how that might work in other like non-human animals or animals without language specifically in this case would be that you, as long as you have multiple interests, so that is multiple ways that you expect things to be and ways that you want the world to be. That's kind of how I'm thinking of an interest. Um, if you have multiple of those that can come into conflict and then you can resolve that conflict for one rather than the other, then that's attention in my view. That so when you're resolving one interest over the other and allowing that to be the thing informing selection, then that's attention. And that can occur in some pretty basic creatures, I think. I don't want to say how basic because I'd have to know a lot about the creature to and also about exactly where that line is for me. And I have not gotten deep enough into this thinking to be able to say exactly where I would want to say the line is. And of course, it might be a fuzzy boundary too. So it might be hard to say, okay, yes, a mosquito, but no, not a worm. I'm not sure exactly where that will be,
Yeah.
but somewhere around just being able to weigh multiple interests in favor of one. And I think it's really likely that lots of animals have that capacity. And so, as a consequence, I'm going to say a lot of animals have a self
Mm,
in this way of talking about it.
yeah.
Not a self, and we talk about this concept of self in many ways, and not a self in the sense of self-knowledge. Maybe you might need language to have self-knowledge, maybe, but we're just talking about not a concept of self, not knowledge of a self, but just do you have a self? Do you have something that's directing your life, directing your mind?
Mhm.
I think you just need attention for that.
Okay. And then I think this is a kind of a perfect way to go into your fourth chapter of the book, which is why you think conscious perception
Mm,
is, or attention is necessary for conscious perception.
yeah. So one of the things that came up for me when I did the kind of historical review about attention in philosophy is that this is really the primary theme on attention in philosophy. Most philosophers in history, of Western philosophy at least, have been obsessed with what does attention do for knowledge? Why do we need attention for knowledge? So even Descartes, to know that the results of your reasoning are true, that they're knowledge, they have to be clear and distinct. Your reasoning has to be clear and distinct. You have to use attention. It's not just that you have any kind of thinking and you have knowledge. It has to be this kind of careful thinking using attention. So attention is something many philosophers have thought is the key to gaining knowledge. And John Campbell, one of the philosophers in recent times that was the first to start talking about attention again, wrote a book where he argued that attention might be at the heart of perceptual knowledge. That's not exactly how he framed it, but I love this. His basic argument is something like this. If you want to have knowledge, you have to have reference. And by reference, he just means you have to have the ability to refer to that thing. You can't know something about something unless you can refer to that thing. Um, So if you want to know something about a can of soda water, you have to be able to refer to the can of soda water. But you can't refer to the can of soda water unless you can separate it from its environment. And what is the ability to separate something from its environment? He thinks that that's attention. So, as he puts it, conscious attention is a thing that enables you to separate an object from its surround. And so, conscious attention is what allows for reference, which allows for perceptual knowledge. And I think that that's a really powerful and really simple set of reasoning that like kind of anyone can see. um, so I liked that. I was really motivated by that. Early in my graduate school career, I was reading his book and thinking about that. In the end, I didn't like some of the basis of his argument. He was depending a lot on the work of someone named Anne Treisman, a psychologist, and I don't think that he can use her work to make the claims that he wants to make. So I agree with him that attention is doing that work. It's just that my reasoning is really different to that route, and I hope on a more stable foundation. So my reasoning is more like this: that if you look at perceptual experience, if you look at what is the fundamental structure of perceptual experience, then it is what distinguishes perceptual experience from just mere sensation, just kind of like the raw data that would come through your senses. The major difference between those, I argue, is that one is informational or meaningful and the other one is not. And so what you're looking for when you're looking for what is the key to perception, the perceptual knowledge, what you're looking for is what gives it meaning or information. And I think that the best candidate for that is subject's role in attention. That what attention does is it's connecting this kind of raw stuff to your interests. And by connecting it to your interests, by kind of ranking the raw input according to your interests, it's saying this thing is more meaningful than this thing to you. And it's giving it that layer of meaning that makes it perceptual. So that's kind of like the crux of my argument, which is really different from John Campbell's, even though we come to the same basic conclusion.
Yeah, and so that's what I also liked, where you have the difference and you kind of break down that different structure. It reminds me, I think, one of the analogies you use in the book, which is like you're lost in a city or something like that,
Yeah,
and as you're walking, and you have all the sense data there, and so it's all in the background, and it's not, and then you're using attention to bring some of that background to the foreknowledge uh,
yeah,
on your interests, and then that kind of starts guiding some of your actions. And
yeah,
because well, since you're lost, you're trying to get to maybe a location, so you're going to need some of that information to pay attention to it, and then
yeah,
kind of bring those the features of the objects into your perceptual awareness, which is different, like you're saying, than just sensory raw sensory data input. um, and
right.
so yeah, I think that's, if I had to uh, summarize, I think that's kind of what you're advocating for.
Yeah. One way in which my style of argument is really different than some of the other philosophers in this domain, that a lot of the other philosophers have focused on each individual percept. So they're like, well, did you pay attention to that can? Were you consciously aware of that can? And what I'm interested in is trying to look at attention not at each percept or each object, but attention as a field. And I think that is a helpful development in the sciences, is thinking of attention as not just operating on the target, but on the target and the surround. So when attention is involved, it both enhances the thing that you're paying the most attention to and it suppresses everything else. And if you see attention as a field, then you realize that attention is involved even if it's not the thing that you're paying attention to. I like to think in terms of a spotlight. So the spotlight metaphor is really old, and people used to think like, okay, attention is all it's doing is it's just lighting up the target, lighting up the thing in the spotlight. But if you think of how if you go outside at night, you don't have any lights on, and then you turn on a flashlight, all of a sudden everything is darker except for what's in the beam of the flashlight. Before you could actually see more, but now that the flashlight's on, you can see what's in the beam a lot better, but everything else you can see worse. And I think that's how attention is. When attention is activated, it doesn't just enhance the thing you want to enhance, it also suppresses everything else. And that's important because when you're asking a question like, well, were you paying attention to the can? Are you conscious of the can? It's kind of hard because you don't know if it's part of the field or not. It's not enough to ask if it's a target. You have to also know if it's being changed by attention at all. And so that's one of the reasons I try to look at like what are the structural changes that attention might bring about and what are the structural features of conscious perception that perception relies on, so you can see that what the work that attention does is exactly the work that makes perception what it is. So it's a kind of a structural argument rather than like a piecemeal argument. Like we don't have to go through the list of everything you're attending to
Hmm.
and check if each thing that you're conscious of or whatever.
Hmm.
I don't know if that helps clarify.
Yeah, definitely. And so, in the kind of in a summary, then you're saying that you need the attention to have that perception or that perceptual awareness.
Exactly.
Perfect.
And that's controversial because people want to say that you can perceive something without attention. That's a really common desire. You want to say that you could perceive something that you have no interest in, that has nothing to do with that you would never have attended to.
Hmm.
And so that bothers people who want that. So that's the way in which it's controversial. Is
Which
it's
is kind of interesting because then it kind of goes into, well, what do you mean by perception? If you mean like if it's in my visual field, is it there and could I attend to it, or would I notice something kind of like in the background information? It's like, well, yeah, that's in my, it's there, possible, and then it's, I mean, but once you're drawing attention to it, it's like, oh yeah, it's definitely there, and this is what it sounds like. Whatever the case, I can be more specific about it. So I guess it kind of it's kind of unclear then of what they would mean by perception or
yeah,
or yeah, what they mean by that. So.
I totally agree. I think that that is a fascinating question of like, well, what is the line between perception and not perception?
Mhm,
I kind of just rely on what everybody else says. It's like about meaning of information.
mhm,
But I think especially if you start acknowledging that it's possible to have conscious sensation that's not perceptual, then it's really hard on introspection to find that line.
mhm,
Like you said, is it like is it conscious? That's like question one. Is it perceptual? That's question two. Is
mhm,
it
mhm,
in the center of my experience? Is it in the center of my attention? That's question three. And each of those steps is difficult to answer.
mhm, yeah,
That may be partially because of fuzzy boundaries, but partially also just because it's hard to tell and conceptually where we should draw the line.
yeah. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So moving along a little bit, one of the next chapter you have why, or at least why you argue, while uh, even though you argue attention is necessary to have conscious perception.
Yeah.
On the flip side, you also believe, or we're stating in the book that for consciousness in general, or maybe just a general type of consciousness, it's
Mhm.
not attention isn't necessary for that. So, if
Okay.
you don't mind, kind of just exploring that a little bit, and then kind of understanding a little bit of the background, but also kind of
Mhm.
going over what you call conscious entrainment.
Yeah, cool. So I just to give a little tiny bit of background on this chapter. One of my advisors in graduate school was Ned Block. And Ned Block has argued for a long time that there's these different forms of consciousness, access and phenomenal. And many people interpret him as saying that attention is not necessary for phenomenal consciousness and it is necessary for access consciousness. So there's a form of consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, that does not require attention. He didn't actually make that link for many years, but other people connected his work to attention that way. So I knew that people did that. I knew people thought that about his work. And I wasn't convinced. I wasn't convinced by his arguments that there was a form of consciousness without attention, that, that's a way that we could understand the evidence that he was putting forward. But like you, I'm really interested in trying to be as charitable as possible to the person that I'm reading and talking to, because I think that that makes our thinking better. So when I'm trying to think about a topic and I disagree with the person I'm reading, sometimes what I'll try to do is we call this like the principle of charity. I'll try to build up the argument to be as strong as possible so that then I can like come back to it, again in response. So I was trying to do that. I was trying to think, well, I don't like Ned's argument, but what argument could I make for this idea that there could be consciousness without attention? And then I suddenly had this idea, this memory, actually, in this case, of an experience I had that I thought, oh my God, I think this is a case of consciousness without attention. And so that was kind of weird because I had at that point argued that attention is necessary for conscious perception. And some philosophers think all conscious experience is perceptual. And so it sounds bizarre, I think, to lots of philosophers to say that attention is necessary for conscious perception, but not consciousness. Like, what could that, like, what are you talking about, Carolyn? I think a lot of people have that instinct. But what I try to make the case for is that there's a special form of conscious experience, conscious entrainment, somewhat rare, where the some of the features of perceptual experience fall away, but it's nonetheless a true form of consciousness. Sometimes people have described these experiences as autopilot and said that they're unconscious by virtue of it being autopilot. And I disagree with that reading of those experiences. So the case that I was remembering when I was kind of trying to think of this argument for Ned Block, the case I remembered was when I was drawing. My father's an artist, and I'm really interested in art. And I remember drawing from life, which is something I used to love to do. And I remember like waking up, feeling like I had just woken up while in the middle of this drawing experience, and realizing at the moment before, I was actually kind of embarrassed because in life drawing, you draw nudes. And it was like the moment before my eye had been on the model. It was like the distance between us had collapsed. And I was like following the model's body with my eye while drawing. And I was like, oh, that's so weird. I gotta stop. So I remember it partly because I was embarrassed, but and on remembering that experience, I realized that there was something interesting about that experience, this collapse of the boundary between subject and object, me as the artist and the art and the person that I was drawing. That I had this experience of kind of waking up. So there seems like there was a sharp transition between two types of experience. And that it happened for a skill, something that I was really highly attuned to doing. And we know that skill can allow for automaticity. That is, it can allow you to do something without attention. And so I knew that this was a possible candidate for a form of conscious experience without attention. So I started to look into literature more to see if that was a story that made sense. And I think that it does. So if you look at the science of flow experience, for example, it is described as using attention. I don't think that that's how we should describe it, but the fact that if you look at those experiences, the person can use these automatic behaviors in lieu of attention. I think that's what's really important. And so if you have a case where someone is using automaticity instead of attention, and they're nonetheless conscious, I think that's a really good case for consciousness without attention. So I give some examples in the book, but I think it's helpful just to think for yourself of whether you've had a skilled experience where you've done something in a kind of flow state automatically or semi-automatically, and whether you've lost your sense of self and what that experience has been like, and if it's different from your kind of normal everyday conscious perception.
Yeah.
I think that'll help you to tap into whether you think that there are these different forms of consciousness.
Yeah, and it's so in one sense you're saying there are times where habitual type of behavior, but also that's kind of skill based or matching on to something like
Yeah.
someone playing the guitar, or they
Yeah.
kind of lose themselves, or someone reading a book and like they're completely unaware of everything else that is happening right now, and then they're just so ingrained within the book, or playing a video game, whatever the case. So you kind of have that kind of skill based where they're losing that sense of self, or they're losing that they have that automaticity going on.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that there's another phenomenon on the flip side, I think, which it was called choking, like when people,
Yeah.
like where when they're on a skill base like that, if they draw attention to it, their skill starts declining,
Yeah.
which is why we call them choking.
Yeah.
But so you have kind of those two phenomenons going on, and it's kind of like, well, it's kind of interesting because if one is saying that you need attention for both of those things, then kind of what explains that drawing attention? Why would they choke if you know what I mean? I forgot how you word it, but it's like if I'm using my attention on the skill base, but I'm losing my sense of self there, but I'm still using attention for that. But then when I start drawing attention to that, my skill declines. So it's kind of an interesting thing phenomenon that happens that which is why I think you argue in that sense, and in the former sense, why you're not really using attention. In the latter sense, in the choking sense, in the phenomenon of that, you are using attention because you're drawing upon what you're doing a little bit.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a really good way of framing why you might think that in flow you're not using attention.
Hmm.
Other One of the ways that I like to talk about it is that there's a difference between focus and attention, and that when you talk about focus, you're really talking about the result of the process, whether you happen to be focused on the thing. And what attention is the process itself of prioritizing your interests and giving more weight to one over the other. And that can result in focus, but it might not. You might have like somebody coming in the room behind you and expending all this effort to try to stay focused on the podcast, but you're not focused on the podcast, but you're still using attention. You're still trying to resolve this tension, but it's just not resulting in focus. So focus and attention, I think, are not the same thing. And then conversely, you could be focused on something without attention. If you think of just like a coffee machine. A coffee machine can separate, this is a Wayne Wu example actually. Coffee machine can separate the grounds of the coffee from the coffee itself, but it's not doing anything interesting. It's just filtering. So if you think of the filtering analogy with the brain, you can result in something like focus in the coffee without anything interesting going on, just with basic filtering mechanisms. And so when attention's involved, it's supposed to be more than basic filtering. There's something more complex going on. So I think that focus doesn't tell you necessarily that you have attention. You can have this automatic mechanisms going on that are resulting in focus. But usually for most of us, we're not thinking really deeply about attention. So the two just kind of overlap a lot in everyday life. So we're not going to separate them. This is really important for flow, I think, because flow, it looks like attention because you're focused on one thing, but I think you're not using that same process. You're not expending any effort. It doesn't feel like effort. You're not weighing up all of the possibilities around you and ranking them. You're just on one thing. And you're like continuing on that one thing. And you're not even considering other possibilities, not at the cognitive level. You're not ranking them and then going for one. You're just doing one thing. But when you're doing that, in the past, people have said, okay, you're on autopilot then. You're not conscious, definitionally. It's automatic, so it's not conscious. And I don't think that that's right. I think that if you look at what people say with these kinds of experiences, even in these really extreme cases of really, sometimes they don't have any memory afterwards of what happened in the experience. I still think that it looks like they were conscious during that experience. It's just a different form of consciousness where they didn't cognize everything. It might not have been perceptual for them. They might not have processed it conceptually, but they still were experiencing it, I think. So,
Yeah, and that's kind of like going into more. You might make more of the like a structural move where it's kind of like I mean, you're still like I'm thinking of like when you're asleep and you have brain activity and you're dreaming, right? There's
uh,
some conscious activity going on there, but is it like like an awake type of consciousness, which is the structure is different.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Dreaming is a great example and I sometimes use this in my talks, like when you wake up from a dream, you might struggle to remember the contents of the dream, but most people still think that they were conscious.
mhm.
And so similarly, if you wake up out of one of these flow states and you can't necessarily remember everything that happened, you're like, where was I?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you weren't conscious. It could be that you weren't conscious. It could also just be it was like this weird form of consciousness where you weren't processing it conceptually.
If so, here's one question: if cognitive science were to when they so like if they hook someone's brain up to like and they got someone into like a flow state,
Yeah.
would it change your mind if you found out that the areas that are associated with like the attention that we're using, would it
Mhm.
change your mind if you found out that they're actually using the correlated neural correlates of attention?
Yeah, I think that would be really hard to do for lots of reasons, but one of them is I think it's probably going to be really rare that you have something clean like what I described. There's really no attention and you're really conscious. I think that experience is going to be rare because what usually happens is um, is that you allow yourself to attend to like broader issues. So you don't attend to, like, when you learn a skill, this is a common description. You might start like with drawing, you start by like focusing on the pencil on the page or something. But over time, you start paying attention to broader issues like the composition of the piece. You don't need to pay attention to how you're holding the pencil anymore. You can pay attention to the composition. And you may keep like leaning further and further back. So what happens a lot of the time is you just use attention at a broader level, rather than it going away altogether. I think it's rare that attention goes away altogether, because I think a lot of the time we do like to keep using attention to, one of my graduate students says, for Kaizen. So you keep using attention to, because you're always improving. Kaizen is this concept of like, you never rest basically on your skill. You always trying to make it better. Like Tiger Woods, I guess, like changed his swing or something in golf. And at first he was worse, but over time he got better. That's Kaizen, apparently. I'm not an expert, but my graduate student introduced me to it, and I think it's a helpful way of thinking about it. So I think it's going to be a rare phenomenon, but specifically what I think is in this thing, I think you mentioned earlier, strategic automaticity, or maybe that was before the podcast started, sorry. But in strategic automaticity, I think that's where if you could somehow narrow in on that behaviorally, I think that would be a good test. So what I think is happening in strategic automaticity is, so your prefrontal cortex, this big, huge part of your brain that most people think of as important for planning, and I guess it's the part of your brain that's doing the kind of organizational work for the sensory motor areas. You have more lateral areas, which are more on the outside of the brain, and more medial areas that are more on the inside of your brain. The lateral areas, like dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which just means like the outside back part of prefrontal cortex. Lateral areas are usually associated with attention, this weighing of multiple options and directing attention to one of them. Medial areas are often associated more with sustaining attention, like keeping your focus on one thing. So you've got the weighing, and then you've got like the keeping the focus. And what you find in a lot of like these skilled states is that they have medial prefrontal activity. So they're staying on the one thing. So you do have like focus in flow states, which is staying on one thing. And what I'm arguing is that what you don't have is this balancing thing, which is the key to attention. And so I think a test case is, and this has been demonstrated somewhat in cases of strategic automaticity, it looks like there are these special cases where instead of it going from the lateral to the medial areas, where the lateral areas are weighing and then determining the focus and then sustaining the focus, instead, can you stop? Sorry, my dogs. Instead, what you're finding is that the lateral connects to the medial, and then the medial feeds back to the lateral, suppressing it. And I think that's a really interesting situation, because basically what it looks like is happening is that your brain is telling itself, let's not consider more options right now.
Yeah.
Let's stay in this fixated version. Let's not do the weighing thing. And that's what I call strategic automaticity. So you're strategically staying on one thing automatically and not continuing to use attention. Mm-hmm. And if that is demonstrated as a thing more conclusively, I think that would be good evidence for the view. Versus, it would be hard to rule out that that's a thing, but if somehow you could rule out that that's happening, like that's not possible or something, then yeah, that would be evidence against the view. Mm-hmm. But I think that is the fact that there is strategic automaticity, I think is just one more point in favor of my argument. Yeah. There's this difference between attention and focus. There's a difference between these types of states.
Mm-hmm. From writing your book, because it's been some time since it's been out now, is there anything that you would change? Any views that you held in the past that you would kind of update now, just based off of new readings or new articles? Because I feel like they come out, like new articles are coming out every day. But yeah, is there anything that you would change?
That's a great question. Fortunately, I'm not yet in the position where I feel that anything I wrote is wrong. I feel very fortunate that I don't have that condition. But I am always kind of learning and growing and thinking on these topics. So some of the things that I'm still developing,
Mm,
but I wouldn't necessarily want to put in this book because I think that there are ideas that can be developed elsewhere.
mhm,
Are more deep consideration of what consciousness is. So I
mhm,
just give a really rough sense in this book, and I wasn't really satisfied with at print with where my view was on that, and I'm still not satisfied. But
mhm,
I want to understand better what consciousness is in this worldview.
mhm, mhm,
It's not the standard way of thinking about consciousness. I know that,
mhm.
but the way I'm thinking about consciousness is so different from the typical version. I know that I need to think about that more and write about that more. So that's
Yeah.
that's a major one. I'm also really interested in just how does this view apply to animals on the one
Mm,
hand
mhm,
and social groups on the other. So that's another direction I would be interested in going. Like how do social groups have attention? Like so if you can have this kind of emergent thing happening in the brain, can you have it at the level of a social group? And I can't really rule that out. Not that I'm interested in ruling it out, but I would
mhm.
like to just know what are the criteria exactly, and can they be applied to non-biological things
Yeah,
like social groups?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, perfect. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast and chatting with me.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure.
Cool. Yeah.
Uh,
Thanks for having me, Jacob. This has been great.
yeah, definitely. Is there a place where people can find you? Websites, things that I can list in the description.
Anybody who wants to like chat with me, feel free to do that over email or on Twitter. I'm on Twitter under @Dicey Jennings. But I have lots of downloads on my website, so I don't remember the exact address, but you can put it in the description.
Sure.
There's
Yeah, yeah.
a bunch of free downloads, so I have all the preprints, not preprints, like the final draft version of a lot of my publications. So if people don't have subscriptions to the journals, that's fine. You can get a download on there.
Perfect.
Yeah, so feel free to reach out.
All right, perfect. I'll leave those all in the description below, including your
Great.
book.
Yeah,
And yeah,
awesome.
all right, perfect.
All right, thanks so much.
And that concludes another episode. See you next time.